Hi, my name is Julie Fuller, an instructional designer at the Center for Instruction and Research Technology at the University of North Florida. Today I'll be talking about best practices in accessibility and universal design for learning. So the purpose of this screencast is to identify some best practices in accessibility in UDL that will enhance the usability of online courses. Let's first take a look at accessibility. Accessibility is the ability of the learning environment to adjust to the needs of all learners. So an accessible course removes barriers for participation so that any student can access an online resource regardless of their disability, technology, or environment. With regard to accessibility, a lot of times accommodations may need to be made. So accommodations are designed to change the strategies that are used that enable students with disabilities to gain access to and engage with the course content and materials. Some common accommodations may include extended test taking time, note takers, video captions or transcripts, ASL interpreters, or large print materials. This is not an exhaustive list. Furthermore, assistive technologies may also be used with regard to accessibility. And assistive technologies are items, software, equipment, systems, etc., that are used to increase or maintain or improve the functional capabilities of those with disabilities. So some common assistive technologies may include screen readers, JAWS being the most common program, communication boards for students with autism, attachment or positioning devices for students with physical limitations, and communication hardware software. So that might include something like Dragon or a speech-to-text recognition program. So an accessible online course has a couple different characteristics. It employs accessible technologies and provides guidance on how to obtain accommodations for students. It contains equivalent alternatives to multimedia. It facilitates readability and minimizes distraction through its design, and it allows for the use of assistive technologies. Let's talk about some common strategies and best practices that you can use to make sure that your course is the most accessible for all students. So in an online course, a lot of times we want to use color to kind of jazz it up and make it look nice. But be aware that color alone should not be used to convey meaning. Reds, greens, and blues are the hardest colors to distinguish for students who have a visual limitation. So it's important that you use color contrasts of 4.5 to 1. And there's a very quick and easy tool that you can use to check color contrasts. It's provided through WebAIM. The URL is here in the presentation. I encourage you to visit it. Essentially, again, a best practice would be to have either a light colored background with dark colored font or a dark colored background with a light colored font, but it's important that the contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 is met. It's also important that you avoid patterned backgrounds. With regard to selecting the fonts that you use in your course, best practice says to use sans serif fonts. So fonts like Verdana, Tahoma, and Arial are the most common and the most friendly. Text styles should be used, and this is especially important if you're working in a program like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint. Instead of bolding your text, you would want to apply a text style like strong. Instead of using italics, you would apply the text style emphasis. Instead of underlining something that's a hyperlink, you would use that hyperlink style. And one of the main reasons for this is that students with screen readers, if you're trying to bold something to emphasize it, they're not going to be able to see that that text is bold. However, if you apply the text style, their screen reader will actually note that as it's reading through your content. So it's important to use text styles. As far as font size, your minimum size should be 12 point. 12 to 14 is typically standard. Spacing should be 20 to 30% of the font size, which is normally standard. And obviously you should avoid all caps. That's the best practice in general. If you have a document that uses heading or tables, it's important that you use proper structures in, again, either Word or if you're working in PowerPoint. And this is important so that students using screen readers, students who may have a visual disability, have access to the structure of the document. So for example, if you are making a list of items, you'll want to use that bullet tool to create an itemized list instead of just putting something like a dash and then typing away. Because the screen reader will go through and it will identify that what the student is interacting with is a bulleted list. If you are working in PowerPoint, it's important to use the slide layouts that are provided. And that's because, again, when a screen reader is reading through a PowerPoint document, the slide layouts indicate the structure of the document, and so the screen reader will know which parts of the PowerPoint to read first. So a best practice with regard to PowerPoint is to avoid using text boxes. Unfortunately, screen readers do not know what to do with a text box, and they typically cannot read them. And so what ends up happening is whatever information you have in your text box is not accessible to that student using a program like JAWS. It's also important to be careful with animations. If your animation is integral to whatever your content is, you may have to provide some alternative form of access. So you may have to provide a description of what's happening in that animation for students who may have visual limitations. In order to check the structure of either a Word or a PowerPoint document to review it to see how a screen reader would read it, you can use the outline view in your navigation pane to check that proper headings are being used. If you have documents with tables, it's important to identify row and column headers in the tables. This is how the screen reader, again, will interact with your table and will be able to figure out the best order in which the different tables and the different information in those tables should be read for students using screen readers. So another best practice would be to avoid using empty columns or rows in your tables. Sometimes this is unavoidable. Sometimes we use an empty column or an empty row because there's a break in the information. But unfortunately, what can happen is when a screen reader gets to that empty column or that empty row, it reads it as the document being over instead of jumping down to the next column or jumping over to the next column. So avoid that if possible. In addition to your table having proper headings and avoiding using empty columns and rows, you should also create a caption for your table. And just a quick caption, this is a table of the data of XYZ. That way, if for whatever reason a student is having problems with their screen reader accessing the table, they at least have a caption there that the screen reader can read to let them know what the table is representing. If you're a person who's familiar with HTML markup, you can also use some quick HTML tags, particularly if you're working in a learning management system, to denote the different row and column headers. So as far as documents and multimedia go with regard to accessibility, there is in Microsoft Office an accessibility checker feature, and we do recommend that you walk through that. What that will do is it will point out areas of concern in your document that may or may not be accessible. So this is a really helpful feature, and it's super quick to just jump in there and double check your document to make sure that it's accessible. You also want to make sure that you avoid using scanned PDFs. So let's say that you've got a hard copy of an article that you want your students to read. You go and you scan it, you make it a PDF, you put it into your course online, and everything's great. Well, the issue with that is that everything isn't great in actuality with regard to accessibility, because when a screen reader comes upon a scanned PDF, it reads it as an image. So unfortunately, it doesn't see it as the PDF, it doesn't see it as the article that maybe it really is, it sees it as an image. So it's important that if you are using PDFs in your course, if they're journal articles, you're linking directly through the library, or you're creating them in either Word and then exporting them into a PDF, or you're creating them directly in Adobe Acrobat. So best practice for creating PDFs would be to use either Word or PowerPoint, go through, use your accessibility checker to make sure that it's mostly accessible, and then export that into PDF. Lastly, when we talk about multimedia, you want to make sure that if you're linking to any kind of external content in your course, that the names of the links make sense out of context. So for example, you see here on my screen, I've got read the accessibility article. And this is a best practice because the students know right away that when they click on the words accessibility article, that's what's linked here, they know that they're going to an article on accessibility. As opposed to the second bad example where it just says read the article here and the word that is linked is here. Well, a student with a visual disability is not going to know where here is. And furthermore, here doesn't explain to any of the students where they are going. So it's important that your links are comprised of meaningful text and that they make sense out of context. If you do use images in your course or in a document, provide alt text for those images. And what alt text or alternative text is it's a textual alternative to non-text content. So if you had an image of a puppy in your course, you could add alt text to denote what it is that that image is trying to convey. And again, this is important for students with visual limitations. So think of alt text as a tweet of no more than 140 characters. Alt text should be very brief and succinct. It should just really include a description of the content and the function of the image. So if for some reason that image is also a link, it would be important to denote that as well in your alt text. And lastly, with regard to multimedia, a best practice is to include captions or accessible transcripts for video and audio. So if you have something like an introduction video in your course, you would want to either make sure that that video gets captioned, which can be done in YouTube, and there are a variety of other ways through which you can have videos captioned. Talk to an instructional designer about that. Or by providing a transcript, a PDF that you can pop underneath that video and say something about accessing the transcript. And this is not just for students who may have hearing impairments, but also for students who have different learning styles. Some students want to be able to read along as they're watching a video or as they're listening to the video and they're reading the transcript. So you're hitting multiple types of learning styles as well when you consider accessibility in your course. Now let's move on to universal design for learning. UDL is a framework for curriculum development that provides a flexible approach for creating instructional objectives, materials, content, assessments, so on and so forth. And UDL's real goal is to make sure that the needs of a variety of different learning styles are being met. So the objective of UDL is to provide multiple means of representation, which is the what of learning, provide multiple means of expression, which is the how of learning, and provide multiple means of engagement, which is the why of learning. So essentially, UDL aims to present information and content in different ways, to provide multiple options or styles for students to be able to express what they know, and to stimulate interest and motivation for learning. So when we talk about multiple means of representation, there are a couple main strategies, and these are not all of them, but these are probably some that you will encounter with regard to online learning. So you want to, again, provide alternatives for audio and visual information, our first strategy here. So a good example of that would be having captions or transcripts for something like a video in your course. It's also important that you clarify vocabulary, symbols, jargon, so on and so forth. So you might consider giving your students a glossary of important terms in the course. And this could be part of your syllabus. It could be its own area within the learning management system. And in addition to that, you want to also activate or supply background knowledge. So this might look like front-loading or pre-teaching some critical concepts or linking to some relevant resources. And most importantly, scaffolding your content appropriately. It's also important that you highlight patterns, any kind of critical features, important ideas, and existing relationships between your content. And you can do that by using outlines, graphic organizers, diagrams, providing examples of previous students' work with their permission, of course. Also by making sure that your instructions and the language that you use with regard to assessments is consistent throughout your course. And lastly, it's important that you incorporate some kind of opportunity for students to review and for them to practice engaging with your content. So this might look like using practice tests or allowing students to have multiple attempts on something. It could also include using peer review assignments or practice tests that are not graded, that wouldn't affect the student's final outcome, but more as an exercise for them to continue to familiarize themselves with your content. Multiple means of expression. Here are some strategies. You want to make sure that you have a variety of tools for communication, and this is both communication instructor to student and communication among students, student to student. So you might compose your content in different types of ways, like text, speech, illustrations, films, music, social media. There are lots of different tools that you can use to encourage communication in your course. You'll want to provide samples of solutions to authentic problems, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about incorporating past student work. Incorporating student work that demonstrates multiple approaches that all kind of come to the same result. You also want to guide appropriate goal setting in your course. So it's important that you have very clear goals and objectives that are student-centered, and that your schedule and your course syllabus are in an obvious place that students can continue to refer to. Embed opportunities in your course to stop and think or to prompt students to show or explain their work. So again, scaffolding is key here. It's important that your scaffolding guides students in the best way to interact with your course content. And another best practice here is to use skills-based assessments to engage higher order thinking skills, to encourage students to express their unique understanding of your course content. And lastly, with regard to multiple means of expression, you want to enhance the capacity for monitoring progress. So essentially what this means is you want to empower your students to be able to keep track of how they're doing in your course. So that might include providing grading rubrics up front, assignment checklists so that students can check off what they've done and what they still need to do with regard to an assignment, and other self-assessment strategies that we talked about with regard to multiple means of representation. And then the final component of UDL encourages multiple means of engagement. So first of all, we all want to recruit interest in our course. We want students enrolling in our course, and after they enroll, we want to keep them interested in the topic. So some of the easiest ways to be able to recruit interest is to allow learners to self-select or participate in interest-based assignments. So if there are group projects in your course, allow students to choose their groups or allow them to choose the topic on which their project will be based. Also allow for varied degrees of performance. So again, if you've got a group project going on, maybe not every group has to submit the same type of assignment, but if they refer to the grading rubric, as long as they're meeting the grading criteria, they have a little bit of creativity as to how they engage with the content. Invite self-assessment and personal response in your course. So use surveys and journals to encourage students to reflect on what they've learned. This not only engages higher order thinking skills, but it also gives you as the instructor some feedback to determine where you may be really excelling in areas of your course and where some areas of your course might need improvement. You also want to make sure that student effort and persistence is sustained. So if you have a large summative assessment in your course, something like a large project or even just a long paper, you want to maybe divide that summative assessment into smaller formative parts that are collected at intervals. And what that will do is give you an opportunity to give your students detailed and constructed feedback so that when you get that final draft, you can see that students have incorporated not only the feedback that you've provided them, but also they've met all of the criteria that you're using to grade this summative assessment. We want to foster collaboration and communication in our courses always. That doesn't change from whether it's face-to-face or online. So if you've got group work, create roles and expectations. I know instructors who have a lot of success with making students sign group contracts so that they're aware of how they need to be collaborating with one another in the course. You want to make sure that you create opportunities for peer interaction. So that might include group discussions or group wiki assignments. And then, of course, as the instructor, you need to maintain a level of presence in your course that shows students that you're there, you're monitoring, you're accessible to them, and you're open to communicating with them. And lastly, with regard to multiple means of engagement, you want to facilitate personal coping skills and strategies. So it's important that in your course, you're not only providing your content for your subject area, but you're also providing students with information about resources for campus-wide support. So that might be student health services, it might be the Disability Resource Center, it might be information about veteran support for students who are veterans. And so just to wrap up here, I want to take a quick look at accessibility versus UDL. Where do they differ and where do they match up? Because they seem very similar in many ways, yet they're different in many ways. So accessibility utilizes prescriptive design standards as outlined in the ADA, sections 508 and 504. There's legalities involved with accessibility. Whereas UDL is more of a pedagogical framework that allows access without the need for adaptation or special design. Both accessibility and universal design for learning consider the specific needs of people with disabilities. They both require sensitivity to and knowledge about people of all abilities. So it's not necessarily disability focused. It's more focused on the idea that we have differing abilities in our course, and how can we make everything accessible with regard to those differing abilities of our students. They both aim to benefit all students. Essentially, we want to empower our students to do well in our course and to engage with our course content. And lastly, they're both designed to be invisible, safe, and physically and emotionally accessible to users. So good universal design for learning and good best practices and accessibility in your online course are essentially invisible to students. Students are not going to jump into your online course and think, wow, this course is so accessible. What they're going to think is, oh, I love the fact that this professor not only provided me with a video, but I have the transcript here if I want to go back and read it some other time. So while they differ in some ways, they're very similar in many other ways. There are some helpful resources that I would recommend if you're interested in learning more about accessibility and or universal design for learning, which include the National Center on UDL, WebAIM, which has that color contrast checker tool that I referenced earlier. Your university may have a disability resource center that you'd want to visit. And the California State University at Northridge, otherwise known as CSUN, has an excellent accessibility education for faculty component of their website. And that URL is here at the bottom if you'd like to visit that site. So hopefully this screencast gives you more information about some ways that you can incorporate strategies for making an online course accessible and incorporating some of the features of universal design for learning. And best of luck in your course.